The Coat Factory Killing, an Alistair Finch Mystery. Part 1, The Quiet Before the Noise. The flat smelled of dust, boiled tea, and someone else's life. Detective Constable, no, Detective Inspector Alistair Finch corrected himself automatically, standing in the narrow galley kitchen with a chipped mug cooling between his hands. The title still felt new, like a suit that hadn't yet learned the shape of his shoulders. The flat hadn't either. It was too quiet, too clean in the way places were when nothing had decided to stay. The kettle clicked itself off. Finch didn't notice at first. He was watching the rain trace uncertain paths down the single window above the sink, each rivulet catching the sodium glow from the street lamp below. Somewhere outside, a bus sighed to a stop. Somewhere else, a radio played something tinny and hopeful, the sound warped by brick walls and distance. He hadn't unpacked much. A chair. A table with one leg shorter than the others. A narrow bed that creaked when he turned over at night, as if surprised anyone had chosen it. The rest of his life sat in cardboard boxes stacked against the wall like evidence no one was ready to catalogue. On the table lay a photograph he hadn't meant to bring out. He'd told himself it was only because he'd been looking for a clean spoon. The photograph was small, curling slightly at the edges. His wife, still his wife, technically, stood in the doorway of their old house, sunlight behind her, irritation already sharpening her smile. Their daughter was beside her, younger then, her face half hidden by hair she refused to tame. Finch remembered the argument that had come just before the picture. Something about a school play he'd missed. Or promised to attend and hadn't. There had been so many of those. He picked up the mug again and took a sip. The tea was too weak. He drank it anyway. The phone rang. It cut through the flat like a blade, sudden and violent. Finch flinched despite himself. The sound didn't belong here yet, it still belonged to the other house, the one with 2 floors and a door that stuck when it rained. The one where the phone rang constantly, always for him. He let it ring twice more before answering. Finch. A pause. Static. Then the familiar, clipped cadence of the duty sergeant. No sympathy. No preamble. Sorry to do this, sir. We've got a body. Finch closed his eyes. The photograph seemed heavier now, as if it were listening. Where? Coat Factory. Down by the docks. Night watch found him about 20 minutes ago. Him. That narrowed it. Finch's mind was already moving, cataloguing possibilities. Accidents dressed up as violence. Violence dressed up as accidents. The docks were good for both. I'm on my way. He hung up without ceremony. The flat swallowed the silence again. Finch put the mug down, grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, and hesitated. For a moment, just a moment, he looked at the photograph again. Then he slid it back into the box and shut the lid. Outside, London met him with wet breath and indifference. The factory squatted at the edge of the warehouse district like a thing that had crawled out of the river and decided not to leave. Corrugated metal walls, windows clouded with grime, a sign over the door advertising a name no one used anymore. A police car idled nearby, its lights painting the rain in rotating blues. Finch stepped under the tape and nodded to the uniform at the door. Inside, the air was colder than the street, heavy with oil, damp wool, and something coppery that had nothing to do with machinery. The body lay between 2 long cutting tables. Male. Mid-40s, perhaps. Wearing a factory coat, stained darker at the chest. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling beams as if counting them. Blood had pooled beneath him, soaking into the concrete, creeping outward like a slow decision. Finch crouched beside him, careful not to disturb anything. He didn't touch. He never touched, not until he had to. Name, he asked. Arthur Bell, said a young constable behind him. Supervisor on the night shift. Supervisor. That meant authority without power. Finch nodded. He scanned the room. Scissors hung from hooks. Heavy irons rested on tables, still warm. Racks of half-finished coats loomed like silent witnesses. Too many places to hide. Too many reasons for someone not to see anything. How'd the watchman find him? Finch asked. Heard a noise. Thought it was rats. Came to check. Finch stood slowly. Rats didn't usually leave wounds like the one in Belle's chest. He looked closer now, seeing the shape of it beneath the torn fabric. Not a clean cut. Jagged. Angry. Personal. Anyone else here tonight? Finch asked. About a dozen workers. Most have gone home. We've kept the rest. Finch exhaled through his nose. A dozen stories. Maybe more. And not one of them would want to be the first to speak. He straightened, rolling tension out of his shoulders. Somewhere in the distance, the river moved, patient and unconcerned. This wasn't just a case. He could feel it already, settling in behind his eyes. Outside, rain drummed steadily on the roof. Inside, the factory held its breath. And somewhere between the two, Alistair Finch took his first step into a career that would cost him more than he understood, standing over a body in a place built to make things, wondering which quiet decision had finally turned lethal. Part 3. Part 2, The Factory and the Fault Lines. Morning crept into the factory without enthusiasm. It came in through the high, narrow windows as a weak, grey suggestion rather than light, catching on dust motes and the drifting steam from a kettle someone had put on in the break room. The place looked smaller in daylight, its shadows retreating just enough to reveal how tired everything was. The machines. The walls. The people. Finch stood near the cutting tables, notebook in hand, watching the workers gather in uneasy clumps. Men and women wrapped in coats that looked no warmer than paper, their faces pinched from the cold and something deeper. None of them met his eyes for long. When they did, there was no anger in it, just calculation. Who speaks first? Who doesn't speak at all? Let's do this one at a time, Finch said, his voice even, pitched low. I don't need speeches. Just the truth. A few heads nodded. One woman folded her arms tighter around herself. Someone coughed. Arthur Bell's body had been removed an hour earlier. The stain remained, dark and stubborn against the concrete, scrubbed at but not erased. Finch noticed how carefully everyone stepped around it, as if the floor itself might accuse them. The factory manager arrived late and loudly. He was a thick-set man in a wool coat too clean for the building, his hair slicked back as if he'd just come from somewhere warm. He introduced himself with his surname only and shook Finch's hand too firmly, as if strength might substitute for cooperation. Terrible business, the manager said, glancing at the floor and then quickly away. Bell was adequate. Did his job. Adequate. Finch wrote it down anyway. Any trouble on the night shift? Finch asked. None worth mentioning. Wages? The manager blinked. Excuse me. Late wages, Finch clarified. Overtime disputes. Union activity. The man's jaw tightened. Just slightly. We're in talks. About what? About everything, the manager snapped, then caught himself. Look, Inspector, this place runs on thin margins. Bell knew that. He was enforcing policy. Finch closed his notebook. Policy has a way of making enemies. So does murder, the manager replied, attempting a smile. Finch let the silence stretch. Eventually, the man cleared his throat. I've got a business to run, he said. You let me know when you're done. Finch watched him go, the man's shoes clicking sharply against concrete that had never known polish. The sound echoed longer than it should have. The workers were less guarded when the manager was gone, but not by much. Finch spoke to them slowly, carefully. Names. Shifts. Who'd seen Bell last? Answers came haltingly, threaded with shrugs and downcast eyes. No one saw nothing, one man said, staring at his hands. It's loud in here. Machines drown things out. Another shook her head. Bell stayed late. Always did. Anyone arguing with him? Finch asked. A pause. Too long. He argued with everyone, someone muttered. That earned a few sharp looks. Finch noted it. About what? He pressed. Money. Hours. Breaks. The voice came from a young woman near the back, her accent flattened by years in the city. He wasn't cruel. Just hard. Hard men rarely died like this for no reason. Finch jotted down her name. He noticed the way she glanced toward the door as she spoke, as if expecting someone to appear and correct her. By midday, Finch had a notebook full of partial truths and practiced omissions. The pattern was there, faint but undeniable. Pressure from above. Pressure below. Bell caught in the middle. What he didn't have was a killer. Outside, the docks were already awake in their own begrudging way. Cranes groaned. Lorries idled. Men moved crates with the weary precision of habit. Finch stood beneath the overhang of the factory entrance, lighting a cigarette he hadn't planned on smoking. He took one drag, then another, the smoke burning his throat. He watched it curl into the damp air and disappear. A uniform approached. "Sir, there's something else." Finch crushed the cigarette beneath his shoe. "Go on." "Some of the lads say Bell was seeing someone." "Not a worker." "A woman." Finch raised an eyebrow. "They know her name." The uniform hesitated. "No. But they said she wasn't respectable." Finch sighed softly. There it was. The unspoken category London reserved for anyone who lived outside the lines. Did they say where he met her? One of them mentioned a club. Somewhere east. Music place. Finch nodded. A lead, thin but alive. As the constable walked off, Finch looked back at the factory. At the windows. At the stain on the floor he could still see in his mind. Somewhere beyond the docks, beyond the rules of his office and the hours he could justify, London was already talking. He could feel it, rumors moving faster than paperwork, truth slipping through fingers clenched too tightly. He didn't know it yet, but the case was already edging toward a part of the city he didn't understand. And toward someone who lived there comfortably. Somewhere in the tangled heart of London's counterculture, a name waited to be spoken, one that would not arrive politely, or safely, or at all on his terms. Part 3, Cindy Lawless. The club didn't have a name that lasted longer than the week. Someone had painted one above the door in flaking white letters, but half of it had been scratched out and written over again in red. Finch stood across the street, rain darkening his hat, watching people drift in and out like they'd found a crack in the city and decided to live inside it. Music thudded through the brickwork, bass-heavy, impatient, almost angry. Not something Finch recognized, but that hardly mattered. It wasn't meant for him. He checked the address again. East of the docks, tucked between a shuttered print shop and a building that had given up on being anything at all. The uniform had been right. Finch crossed the street. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, smoke, and something sweet that turned his stomach. Colored lights flickered without rhythm, throwing faces into brief, distorted clarity before swallowing them again. Finch stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, his ears separate noise from meaning. He was already out of place. He knew that. The coat, the shoes, the way he stood as if expecting the room to explain itself. People noticed. Some turned away. Others watched him openly, curious rather than afraid. He moved toward the bar. The bartender looked at him like a problem. "We're full." "I'm not staying," Finch said. "I'm looking for someone." The bartender's gaze flicked briefly to Finch's shoes, then back to his face. "Aren't we all?" Finch reached into his pocket, not for his warrant card, but for the cigarette case he rarely used anymore. He set it on the bar and slid it forward. "Arthur Bell," he said. Tall. Dark hair. Worked nights at the coat factory down by the river. The bartender didn't touch the case. "Never heard of him." "Woman," Finch added. "Came in with him sometimes." That got a reaction. "Not much." "Just enough." "Lots of women come in here," the bartender said. "Some with men who deserve what they get." Finch didn't rise to it. "She lived nearby." A beat. Then, you want Cindy? Finch nodded slowly. I want to talk to her. The bartender snorted. Good luck. Cindy Lawless was sitting on the edge of the stage, legs dangling, boots tapping in time with the music. Her hair was a riot of dark curls, half pinned back, the rest doing whatever it pleased. She wore a jacket that had seen better decades and a look that suggested she was already bored of the present one. She noticed Finch immediately. Most people did. You lost, she called over the music, not bothering to lower her voice. Finch walked closer, careful on the sticky floor. That depends. On what? On whether you're Cindy Lawless. Her smile was sharp and unapologetic. Depends who's asking. Finch reached into his coat and showed her the warrant card, just long enough to register. Not long enough to invite a crowd. Well, Cindy said, hopping down from the stage, this is already my least favorite conversation of the day. She led him toward a side corridor without waiting to see if he'd follow. Finch did. The corridor was quieter, the music reduced to a distant throb. Posters peeled from the walls, advertising bands that no longer existed or never had. You're about Arthur Bell, Cindy said, lighting a cigarette. You've got that look. What look is that? Like you already know the ending and you're annoyed someone made you sit through the middle. Finch ignored the comment. You knew him. Knew of him. You were seeing him. Cindy exhaled smoke, slow and deliberate. Seeing is a strong word. Were you arguing with him? She laughed. Not kindly. Everyone argued with Arthur. That was his talent. Did you kill him? Cindy stepped closer, eyes bright. If I had, you wouldn't be asking so politely. Finch studied her. She didn't fidget. Didn't look away. Reckless, yes. Afraid, no. What did you argue about? Finch asked. Money. Work. The usual, she said. He was squeezing people who had nothing left to squeeze. I didn't like that. You work at the factory. God, no. Then why involve yourself? Cindy tilted her head. Because someone had to. Finch felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes. You live dangerously. Only according to people who think rules keep them safe. She flicked ash toward a cracked tile. Arthur was scared, she added, almost as an afterthought. Of what? Of his bosses. Of the men who own places like that but never set foot inside them. She shrugged. Of people who don't like attention. Finch wrote it down. You should be careful, he said. Cindy smiled again, softer this time. You should be faster. She stubbed out her cigarette and turned back toward the noise and light without waiting for permission. Finch watched her go, a flicker of color swallowed by darkness and sound. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep and unwelcome, that she was already ahead of him. And that if he wanted the truth, he might have to follow her somewhere he'd sworn he wouldn't go. Part for recklessness and consequences. Finch dreamed of the factory that night. Not the body, never the body, but the sound. The relentless clatter of machines, metal teeth chewing through fabric, drowning out voices that were trying to be heard. He woke before dawn in the narrow bed of his flat, heart ticking too fast, the city pressing in from all sides. He dressed without turning on the light. The kettle whistled. He didn't pour the water. Somewhere, a phone rang in another flat, and for one foolish moment he thought it might be his wife, calling to ask if he'd slept at all. It wasn't. It never was. By the time he reached the station, Cindy Lawless was already there. Not inside, she was leaning against the railings across the street, coat collar up, cigarette glowing like a dare. Finch slowed, irritation flaring first, then something more complicated. You shouldn't be here, he said when he reached her. Cindy grinned. You shouldn't look surprised. This is a police station. So's the factory, she replied. Didn't stop anyone. Finch glanced around. Morning commuters hurried past, eyes fixed forward, professional blindness fully engaged. You followed me. Of course I did. She flicked ash into the gutter. You don't know how to walk quietly when you're thinking. He didn't like that she was right. What do you want? He asked. To tell you you're asking the wrong questions, Cindy said. Arthur Bell wasn't the problem. He was the message. Finch stiffened. Careful. You think the factory manager runs anything, she continued. He answers to men who don't put their names on buildings. They've been skimming wages, cutting corners, leaning on Bell to make it happen. When he started pushing back, when he got scared enough to talk. He gets murdered, Finch finished. Cindy nodded. Not by a worker. By someone sent to remind everyone where the line is. Finch stared at her. And you know this because one of the men who drinks at the club also drives for them, she said. Because he doesn't sleep well anymore. Because he said Arthur wouldn't be a problem much longer, 2 nights before he died. Finch felt the familiar pull, truth tugging at him from outside the rules. You didn't tell me this yesterday. You didn't ask, Cindy said. And I wanted to see what you'd do. That's reckless. That's honest. Finch looked back at the station doors. If he took this inside, it would be buried under procedure before it ever breathed. Anonymous sources. Unreliable witnesses. No appetite for dockside scandals that reached higher than they were supposed to. What's the driver's name? He asked quietly. Cindy's smile was quick, triumphant. I knew you weren't boring. The warehouse was technically abandoned. In practice, it was very much alive. Finch waited in the car while Cindy slipped inside through a side door that had never bothered to lock properly. He told himself this was surveillance. He told himself he wasn't complicit. The radio crackled softly, a football score bleeding through static. Finch's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. Every instinct he had told him this was wrong, procedurally, professionally, personally. The door banged open. Cindy ran. She was laughing, actually laughing, as she threw herself into the passenger seat. You should have seen his face. Jesus Christ, Finch snapped, pulling the car into gear as voices shouted behind them. What did you do? Asked him questions, she said, breathless. He admitted enough to hang himself twice over. That's not how this works. It is today. A bottle smashed against the wall behind them as Finch accelerated, tires shrieking in protest. The shouts faded. Silence rushed in to replace them. Finch pulled over 3 streets later and killed the engine. He turned on her slowly, fury finally finding words. You could have been killed. Cindy's grin faltered. You could have done something sooner. The words landed harder than she meant them to. Finch looked away, jaw tight. You don't understand, he said. There are ways this has to be done. And while you wait, she shot back, people die. They stared at each other, the truth suspended between them like a loaded thing. Finally, Finch reached for his notebook. What did he say? Cindy exhaled, rubbing her arms. He named a man. Not the manager. Someone above him. Someone who never comes near the docks. Finch wrote it down, every letter deliberate. This doesn't leave this car, he said. Cindy nodded. I figured. As she opened the door, she paused. You're not as different from me as you pretend, she said softly. Then she was gone. That evening, Finch stood in his flat, the phone pressed to his ear. His wife's voice was tired. Distant. I can't do this anymore, Alistair, she said. I'm already alone. He had no argument left. Only silence. When he hung up, the flat felt smaller than ever. In the dark, Finch sat at the table and stared at his notebook. At the name. At the line he had crossed without quite stepping over it. The case was breaking open. So was everything else. Part 5, the resolution and the scar. The arrest happened quietly. No sirens. No cameras. Just a knock on a door in Hampstead that had never known the sound of machinery or the smell of wet wool. Finch stood on the step with 2 officers beside him, rain misting the cuffs of his coat, the city subdued in a way it rarely was. The man who opened the door looked surprised, but not confused. That told Finch everything. He was well-dressed, well-fed, and already annoyed. His name was on no factory paperwork, no public registry that mattered, but it had come up enough times, always indirectly, always with lowered voices. He owned interests. Holdings. He believed in efficiency. When Finch said Arthur Bell's name, the man sighed. "I warned him," he said, as if discussing a faulty appliance. They found the knife in a drawer that smelled faintly of oil. They found phone records that matched the driver's account, corroborated just enough to satisfy a prosecutor who didn't want this to go too far. The case would be presented as a dispute that escalated. A regrettable necessity. Finch knew better. So did everyone else. The official story was neat. Arthur Bell had been under pressure. He'd met privately with someone he trusted. Things had gone wrong. There would be a conviction. A sentence that sounded long enough on paper. The factory reopened 2 weeks later under new management. Wages were adjusted just enough to quiet the union. The men above the man at the door never appeared in any report Finch would sign. That was how it worked. Finch stood at the edge of the dockyard the evening the case was closed, watching the river slide past like it had already forgotten. The cold cut through his coat. He welcomed it. It felt honest. Cindy Lawless found him there. She didn't announce herself. She never did. "So that's it," she said, leaning against the railing. "World fixed." "One man's in custody," Finch replied. "That's something." "It's not enough." "No," he agreed. "It rarely is." She studied him, really looked this time. "You're going to keep doing this," she said. "Even knowing how it ends?" "Yes." "Why?" Finch thought of the factory floor. Of the body. Of the name in his notebook that had almost stayed there. "Because someone has to remember what actually happened," he said. Cindy smiled, a little sadly. "Careful, Inspector. That's how you end up alone." He met her gaze. "I already am." They stood together for a moment longer, the river between past and future, neither of them belonging entirely to either. Then Cindy pushed off the railing. "If you ever need something you can't get through a warrant," she said, "you know where to find me." "I don't make a habit of it," Finch replied. She laughed as she walked away. "No. You just make exceptions." The flat was emptier when Finch returned. Her things were gone. The photograph was gone too. In its place, a note on the table, folded once. "I hope one day you learn how to come home." He sat with it until the words stopped shifting. Later, much later, Finch stood by the window and looked out at London, at the lights, the movement, the endless accumulation of quiet decisions. He understood now that this case would never leave him. Not because of the violence, but because of the compromises. The way justice bent without breaking, and how often people mistook that for success. This was his first major case. It would not be his last. But it was the one that taught him what the job would cost, and what it would never quite give back. Somewhere near the docks, machines hummed again. Somewhere else, a woman named Cindy Lawless lit a cigarette and smiled at a city that refused to behave. And in a small flat with too much silence, Detective Inspector Alistair Finch stood alone, already becoming the man London would need him to be, whether it deserved him or not.